You picture Jesus as calm, gentle, and always smiling. But one afternoon in Jerusalem, he grabbed a whip, flipped over tables, and cleared out an entire marketplace. This is the story most people have never actually heard, and it might completely change the way you picture the gentlest man who ever lived. To understand why he snapped, you first have to understand where it happened. The temple in Jerusalem, considered the single holiest place on all the earth. This wasn't just any building. For the Jewish people, it was God's actual home on earth, the one address where heaven physically touched the ground. Once every year, at Passover, hundreds of thousands of pilgrims flooded into the city to worship, to pray, and to offer their sacrifices to God. Every single family was expected to bring an animal to sacrifice, a spotless lamb, a healthy goat, or, for the poorest, two small doves. But here's the catch. If you'd traveled for weeks to get there, dragging a live lamb hundreds of miles across the desert simply wasn't practical. So it became normal to simply buy your sacrifice once you finally arrived, and that little convenience is exactly where the whole thing went rotten. Merchants set up shop right inside the temple courts. They sold the animals, but at wildly marked up tourist trap prices that you simply couldn't argue with. Then came the official inspectors. Your own lamb, carefully brought from home, could be declared imperfect and rejected, forcing you to buy one of theirs instead. It was a scam wearing a holy face, and somehow it got even worse because you couldn't even pay for any of it with normal money. The temple only accepted its own special coin. Roman and Greek money, stamped with the faces of emperors and pagan gods, was strictly forbidden inside. So the money changers sat at their tables, swapping your everyday coins for the approved kind and charging a fat little fee every single time. Change your money, get overcharged. Buy an animal, get overcharged. Fail the inspection, buy another. And the poorest pilgrims were always squeezed the hardest of all. And where exactly was all of this happening? Not in some back alley. It filled the court of the Gentiles, a sacred part of the temple itself. That court had one sacred purpose. It was the single place where non-Jews from across the world were allowed to come and quietly pray to the living God. Instead, it had become a noisy, stinking marketplace, bleeding animals, clinking coins, shouting merchants, and haggling crowds all drowning out every last quiet prayer. Imagine walking for miles just to finally meet with God, only to find his house turned into a crowded, corrupt shopping mall. That is what Jesus walked into. Now remember, this is the same Jesus who blessed little children, healed total strangers, and told people to turn the other cheek. The living picture of gentleness. But the moment he saw what they had done to his father's house, something inside him shifted. He stopped walking. He watched closely, and he did not smile. Calmly and deliberately, he knelt down and began braiding together a whip out of loose cords. This was not a sudden outburst. This was a decision. Then he slowly stood back up, and the gentlest man who ever lived walked straight into the middle of that busy marketplace and completely let loose. He drove out the sheep and the cattle. He cracked the whip and sent the merchants scrambling for the exits, tripping over their own scattered goods. Then he reached the money changers. He grabbed the very edges of their heavy tables and flipped them, sending coins spraying everywhere across the stone floor. Picture it. Hundreds of coins bouncing everywhere, and greedy grown men suddenly down on their knees, scrambling to grab their scattered profits up off the ground. To the men still selling doves, he turned and ordered, "Get these out of here!" And the cages flew open, birds bursting up into the open sky. Within minutes, it was total chaos. Animals stampeding, coins rolling, merchants fleeing in every direction, and one single man standing utterly calm in the center of it all. Then he said the words that explained everything. "My house will be called a house of prayer, but you have turned it into a den of robbers." A den of robbers. He wasn't simply annoyed about the noise or the crowds. He was furious that they were robbing desperate people in the name of God. And they weren't only robbing money. By clogging up the one court open to outsiders, they were robbing the entire world of its access to God. This is the key that the church has always pointed to. His anger was never a loss of control. It was love that simply refused to stay silent. There's actually a word for this in the Gospels: zeal, a burning, protective passion. As John records it, zeal for your house will consume me. In the Orthodox tradition, this exact moment is remembered every single year during Holy Week, right before the cross. And that timing is absolutely not an accident. Cleansing the temple was a living picture of his whole mission. Christ came to clear out the corruption and open up the way for us back to God. The powerful temple leaders were watching all of this unfold, and they were not asking whether he was actually right. They were asking who gave him the authority. By what right do you do these things? They demanded. They had no interest in fixing the corruption. They wanted to protect their profits and their power. And here is the detail that most people completely miss. This confrontation, this bold challenge to the powerful, helped set his execution into deadly motion. The man who flipped those tables knew exactly what it was going to cost him. And he did it anyway, because some things are simply worth the price. So, what does this ancient story actually mean for you, sitting here 2,000 years later? Honestly, probably a whole lot more than you might expect. First, it completely shatters the idea that being good just means being a pushover. Real gentleness is never weakness. Sometimes real love has to flip a table. Second, it quietly asks an uncomfortable question. If Jesus was this furious about a corrupt marketplace, what corners of your own life might genuinely need cleaning out? Because this story was never really only about a building. It's about whatever we allow to clutter the space that was meant for something far greater. So the next time someone tells you Jesus was only ever soft and quiet, you can tell them all about the afternoon that he sat down and made a whip, the day that he walked into the holiest place on all the earth and flat out refused to let his Father's house be turned into a marketplace. That is the Jesus the Gospels actually show you. Not weaker than you imagined, but stronger and far more interesting than the picture on any greeting card. And if this completely changed how you see him, well, that is exactly why this channel exists. The real stories, told straight, with humor and a lot of heart. So go ahead and subscribe, and then stick around. Because we are only just getting started, and the Bible is full of moments far wilder than you were ever taught. Next time, we'll unpack another story you only think you know. But until then, just remember, even the gentlest man alive knew exactly when to flip the table.